Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sit with Shy. Today I am joined by Julia and we're going to be talking a little bit about writing, reading and books and literature in general. Before we delve into the actual episode, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and like how you came to love reading and things like that?
Of course. So my name is Julia, as you've already introduced me. I'm a recent college graduate. I actually majored in biology. So growing up, I was mostly a STEM person. I excelled more in science and math subjects, but I always did enjoy reading. I think that the rigor and the demands of the high school I went to, because I did go to a quite academically competitive high school, kind of soured my desire to read for a bit, simply because a lot of the English classes and history classes I were taking were just so demanding that I kind of just didn't really want to read for fun anymore. It wasn't until college, late college, I should say, that I got back into reading and rediscovered just my love for reading and how fun it could be. I actually took a class. It was a science fiction fantasy class that I had to take for a GE requirement, but we just read a lot of fiction, and I realized that there are genres of literature that I do still really enjoy. And ever since then, I've just been reading a lot, and I spend a lot of time on social media just looking for book recommendations. I love the book community. So that's kind of where I am right now. I read probably 3 to 4 books a month, and I'm very happy with that.
Wow. That sounds fantastic. Where do you first and foremost find the time to get through that many books a month? I would love to. How do you balance your schedule to be able to obviously like work and then also enjoy your time with the reading?
Yeah, so I think when you really have a book that you enjoy, so I guess that'd be my first piece of advice is read books that you're actually interested in, read books that you actually enjoy, because when you really want to hear more of a story, when you really want to find out what happens to a group of characters or whatnot, you will find the time to get that in. So I know for me, I take a book with me pretty much everywhere I go. So when I go to work, I'll read on my lunch break if there's no one else for me to really talk to, because that does happen sometimes where I work. So I always kind of have a book on hand. So if I have any sort of breaks anywhere, even 15, 20 minutes, you can get, a good few pages out of that. I also read before I go to bed. It helps relax me so that I can fall asleep, which is nice. I know some people have the issue of staying up really late to finish a book. I don't typically have that issue. Even if I really like a book, there is a point where I'm like, okay, I'm tired. I want to go to bed, so I'll just fall asleep. But yeah, I think just having a book on hand, like wherever you are, using those like little breaks that most people have throughout the day, instead of scrolling on, social media, you can just get some pages out. And then, yeah, just finding ways to fit it in throughout your day, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's some really good advice, and it's true. If you really engage or if you really love a story and its characters, you will try and find the time to get through it throughout a busy day. So you're definitely right about
Yeah, I hear a lot of people. I don't have anything against nonfiction books. I do read nonfiction now and then, like self-help books and stuff like that. But I do think there is this pressure, kind of like in society at large, that if you want to read, you have to read very like intellectual books, or you can only read books that are like furthering your education or teaching you new skills. And it's great to read books that are like that, but I don't think that's exactly the right way to encourage people to really love reading. I think if you want to get into reading, be brutal, like be brutally selective with what you actually like. Don't conform to what book society says you have to read. Just read what you love and it'll come a lot more naturally.
it. I think that's really good advice as well. There's been a few occasions where I've picked up a book where maybe it's been recommended by a lot of people and they're like, it's fantastic, you need to read it. And I read it and I was like, oh. So I get what you mean with the pressures of just because the book is liked by everybody, you feel like you might have to read it as well. But I guess find your own avenue and lanes with the genre that you really, really like. Going into genres, what kind of genres are you particularly interested in?
My favorite genre of all time would definitely be science fiction. I think it's really interesting. I think it's very diverse. It's interesting because there are different sides to science fiction. You can find science fiction books that are more philosophical, and that really try to deal with the human condition or certain political issues that are going on even now. But then there's also a side of it that's more adventurous, where you can kind of just follow characters in this cool new setting. And then there's also a kind of sci-fi fantasy. A lot of books are kind of a sci-fi fantasy fusion. And I think that's interesting too, where you're kind of towing the line between a sort of scientific basis, but also having kind of a magical foundation to it. I think that's really interesting. So I really like science fiction. But I will say I read a pretty wide range of books across many different genres. I don't really discriminate that much because I do think that there are good books in every genre. But yeah, science fiction would be my number one.
Okay. Is there a book within the science fiction genre that you would recommend for the listeners to read? If so, what is
Yeah,
it?
so I really enjoy the more philosophical side of science fiction. So I really like books that kind of make me consider the human, like things about the human condition, make me really ponder like philosophical questions. So I really enjoy the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. It's actually the inspiration for the movie Blade Runner. I don't know if I don't know if you've seen that, but it is a popular movie.
Yeah.
And then other books. So one author that I've been reading a lot is Ursula K. Le Guin. She's one of the first female authors in the science fiction genre. So she wrote books in like the 60s and 70s. But one of my favorite books of hers is The Word for World is Forest, which a lot of people speculate is the inspiration for the movie Avatar.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy that book. It's also pretty philosophical. There's a little more adventure to it than I would say Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but those are two books that I'd really recommend for anyone who would want to explore the more philosophical side of science fiction. For the people who maybe want something a little more exciting, something that's a little more plot driven instead of like character driven, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a really good one. I think it's it's kind of like the golden standard for sci-fi adventure. So I would recommend that book.
Fantastic. I'll find the titles of what you said and I'll link them in the description box for people that might want to go and explore some of those recommendations. You mentioned that some of those books might have been turned into movies. What do you actually think about books that have been turned into movies? Do you tend to prefer the books themselves, or do you think sometimes that the movies are better? What's your opinion?
That's such a good question because I have put a lot of thought into it. So I feel like a lot of readers, or at least the narrative that kind of permeates like reader culture is that books are always better than the movies. Like everyone is always just saying like, oh, the book was better than the movie. I don't subscribe to that. I think there are movies that actually do a better job than the books. I think one really good example is The Shawshank Redemption. I think the movie is better than the book. The book is was written by Stephen King, who's a great writer, but I don't think it's like his strongest book. But I think the movie is genuinely better than the book. Another one that is going to be quite controversial, but I actually like the Hunger Games movie more than I like the Hunger Games book. I think they're both good at the end of the day, but that is one of my hotter takes. But I do think that movies can be better than books at times, but at the same time, I don't really get much joy out of comparing them because they are very different ways of telling a story. So the way that cinema is and the way that you convey a story through visual media is fundamentally different than the way you convey a story through literature. So I understand why people compare them because obviously if you're adapting the same story, then there's inevitably people are going to make comparisons. But I don't know. I try to enjoy both of them. Of course, there are instances where movies will absolutely butcher
Yeah.
a book's plot, and that is always so sad to see. But I think people should give more credit to movies. I think they try. They try.
Yeah. I actually agree with a lot that you said. To be honest, they're two completely different mediums, and sometimes it's a bit hard to compare them, especially when they're trying to portray a story. Sometimes in a little bit of a different way. What do you feel though about movies that take a particular plot and then they somewhat change it? So I'm trying to think of an example. So one that comes to mind is ooh, Noughts and Crosses. They made like a TV adaptation. I don't know if you would have seen it over in the US. It was slightly different than the book, and also The Handmaid's Tale was slightly different than the book as well. I enjoyed both of them, but obviously, when you've read a book and you've really enjoyed it, and then you watch it play out on the screen and it's a bit different, you are a bit taken aback, a bit shocked. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it is disappointing. I have experienced that personally. It is kind of hard, especially if, they change something that you feel was really important to the story or really important, for a certain character to experience or something like that. But it also doesn't surprise me. See,
Yeah.
I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten better at checking my expectations before I go see movies,
Hmm.
simply because the demands of the film industry and the influence of Hollywood is different than the demands of the publishing industry. And there are certain like trends in Hollywood that filmmakers have to really conform to. And as a result, they might make different choices when they're trying to tell a story. And that might include, eliminating a certain plot point that was present in a book, or maybe changing a character in some way, or maybe eliminating or even putting in a relationship that wasn't initially there. So I don't love it. It is disappointing, and I don't blame anyone for being upset when that happens. But I don't know. I think as I've gotten older, and I think I understand the film industry more, and I understand that you know a lot of creative executives aren't they're not free to just do whatever they want. There are higher ups that influence kind of the creative decisions that they make, for better or for worse. But it is an industry. They are trying to make money. So at the end of the day, there might be certain changes that, they make simply to, have the movie make more money, sell more tickets, which sometimes is unfortunate, but I don't know. I've come to expect it at this point.
Yeah. Well, another question I wanted to ask you as well is, has there been a book that's ever made you cry? And if so, what was the title?
Let me think. I'm not much of a crier when it comes to fiction, but there definitely have been a few. So, okay, I think two come to mind. So, one that came to mind, I read over this past summer. It's actually pretty short. It's about like a little over 200 pages, but it's called The Secret Life of Bees.
Ooh,
And they also made a movie with it.
yeah.
The movie was fine, um, but it's about a young girl in I think 1950s South Carolina, somewhere in the South, who her mother dies when she's young, so she lives with her dad, but her dad is kind of abusive. So eventually, a bunch of stuff happens, and she runs away with her housekeeper.
Hmm.
And they run away to this farm that her mother supposedly was like familiar with in some way. That's kind of the mystery. They don't really know what the mother's connection is to this farm, but they go back to this farm and they meet this trio of sisters who are beekeepers, and they sell honey. And it's it's a pretty character driven story. It really focuses on this young girl and her kind of coping with the loss of her mother, and uncovering the history behind her mother's life, and then also kind of dealing with her father, because her father is looking for her after she runs away,
Yeah.
and deciding kind of where she wants to go with her life, and if she returns to stay with her father, if she tries to pave her own way. But there are some very sad moments in the book, and there are moments that just had me I don't know. Just really thinking about parenting and the fact that some children don't get even one decent parent, and
Mm.
that's really sad. So that book had me pretty sad at moments, but it's really good. And I finished it, and I felt like there are some books that I finish, and I feel like I've genuinely come out a different person, and that was one of those books for me.
I'm gonna seek out to read the book then, 'cause I didn't know there was a book version. I just seen the movie, so I didn't know that there was it was based on the book. So I'm definitely gonna read it now. Sounds
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah, it's good. And then the other book I read that this one was very recent. I finished it like a couple weeks ago, but it's called All the Light We Cannot See,
Mm.
um, by Anthony Doerr. I'm not entirely sure how to say his last name, but it's a
Yeah.
historical fiction book. It takes place in World War One, and it focuses on a blind girl who is growing up in France, and then a young boy who is growing up in Germany. And it kind of alternates point of views between these two characters mostly. And it follows kind of their lives as the war progresses and where they end up. And that book, towards the end, really got me because there is a lot of really sad stuff that goes on. Of course, you know, it's a war.
Yeah.
But it's really good. It's incredibly well written. It won a Pulitzer Prize
Oh well.
recently. I forget what year. But they're also making a Netflix movie. It's coming out in November. And I think I forget his name. Mark Ruffalo is playing one of the characters, and I just
Mhm.
thought that was funny because I cannot associate Mark Ruffalo with anyone but the Hulk from
Yeah.
like the Marvel movies. So I just saw him in the trailer, and I was like, oh, it's that guy.
I'll definitely look out for that one and have a watch and then see if I can find the book as well. Thank you
Mhm.
for sharing that with us. Um, One of the ones that I would probably say is a book called Marmee by Jessica George. She's a Black British writer, and the book centers around basically like her finding herself and her identity, and then balancing like family and family pressures, and her finding her voice. And it was an up and down throughout the book. Like there was really funny moments and there were really serious moments. And I think the moments where you're crying, it's not necessarily because you're sad, it's because you're kind of like celebrating the character and what she's achieved throughout the whole story. So if you have time, I think you should read that one. It's really good.
Okay, no, I'll add it to my to read list. I love stories like that. I'm very much I love stories that are character driven. I just love seeing people grow and change.
Yeah.
I think it's very inspirational because, you know, I seek to do that in my own life. So I like to see it in fiction as well.
Hmm. I agree. What to you makes a good character?
Hmm. Um, well, I think that the character needs to be real,
Mm.
in the sense that they have to have some flaws, and it has to they have to be real flaws. I think that there are certain books that will sometimes attempt to present a flawed character, but all the flaws are presented in very like endearing and charming ways. Like, oh, this
Mm.
character is really clumsy, and it's like being clumsy isn't a real flaw though. Like it's a mild inconvenience at most.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest things for me is like a good character has to have some real flaws. And then they also have to have some like goals and motivations.
Mm.
I don't think every character has to have goals and motivations simply because there are some books that there are people, I mean, there are real people in real life who are very passive and don't really know what they want in life. I think that in itself can be a basis for a good character, so long as like at some point in the story they do, you know, come up with some sort of goal or motivation in life. But yeah, I mean, I think those are like the most basic things for me personally that I care about is I'd like the character to have some real flaws, just to sort of, you know, humanize them, make them feel like they're a real person. And then they also need to have some sort of goal in mind. They have to want something at some point, even if they don't immediately want something at the beginning of the story. Eventually, I do think, I don't know, just reflecting real people. At some
Yeah.
point, most people do want something out of life, and it's nice to see that in fiction as well.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think that the protagonist, though, of the story, do you think that they have to be likable characters? Because I had a discussion with this about this story with someone not long ago. Do you think that they have to be a likable character, or do you think it's more interesting when the main character has traits that aren't that likable, or they've done things that aren't that likable?
I personally really do think I really like stories that have unlikable protagonists or problematic protagonists.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting simply because I don't, when I read fiction and I talk about characters that I like, um, I don't necessarily look for characters that I can relate to. I don't care about the relatability aspect as much. I care a lot more about, is this a person that I think could exist in real life,
Yeah.
on like a character personality level. So I think it's really interesting to have stories that follow characters that are flawed in ways that are like make it genuinely difficult to like them at times.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's totally possible to write a good story like that. I think it's a little harder to pull it off for sure.
Yeah.
But I do not personally subscribe to the belief that, you know, if you're writing a book, that you have to write the protagonist to be likable by the audience. I think I think the most important thing is that they're interesting, and that the reader wants to find out what happens to them or what they do. But I don't think they necessarily have to be likable.
Yeah, definitely. I actually agree. I fully agree. And then on the flip side, what do you think makes a good antagonist? Because I found a lot of antagonists in stories and movies, to be fair, where you shouldn't really like them, but there's just something about them that kind of is endearing or charming about them. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I found that too. I think that a good villain can really just steal the show. I That actually brought up a memory for me. So, a few years ago, my mom and I went to see Beauty and the Beast performed live, like
Yeah.
as a musical,
Mhm.
and the I mean, maybe it was just the acting, but the guy who played Gaston was so good. And we left the theater and it was the only thing we could talk about. We were like, man, like what a good villain. Like, I mean, I knew the story. I had seen the Disney movie, but it was just seeing it like that. I was like, wow, like Gaston is actually such a good villain. And I think that that happens a lot in many different kinds of media, whether it be books or movies or TV shows, where the villains kind of steal the show just because I think part of it is because with villains, writers can afford to make them more dramatic, afford to make them
Mhm.
more eccentric. They don't have to worry as much about the villains being relatable or palatable to the audience. So they can
Mhm.
really go wild with these characters a lot of the time. And I think because of that, it makes them more memorable.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing. But I think the other thing is that, especially in recent decades or maybe just years, but I think there's been this trend of people writing, like really focusing on the idea of the sympathetic villain.
Mm.
So, you know, I remember being a kid and watching a lot of movies, and a lot of the villains would be very two dimensional, pretty black and white. They were, you know, wholly evil. There wasn't really any redeeming qualities there. I think recently there has been a trend in a lot of media of writing villains that are more sympathetic, villains that are more multidimensional. I think because of that, that has drawn in more people to them because people can kind of understand them better because they feel, because they're more multidimensional, because they have more complexity to, you know, their moral compass or whatnot, the decisions they make, the audience can kind of relate to them a little better.
Yeah.
So that can also draw in like new fans and just people who like them.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree. Do you think it comes from a part of us seeing some of ourselves not only in the protagonist but also in the villain as well? So maybe even though what they're doing is bad, maybe we kind of understand somewhat the motives of why they're doing certain things. Do you think that's why maybe modern day villains we tend to lean a bit more towards?
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of it that's really comforting to see, because I think we've all, you know, we've all done something that we're not proud of at some point in our lives.
Mm.
Um, and to be able to read a book or watch a film or something and see a character that has also done bad things or, you know, maybe is even currently doing bad things, but has genuine reasons why they're doing it. Not necessarily that those reasons justify it, but there is a reason why they're acting the way that they are. I think it's kind of comforting because I think it can reaffirm to the audience that most people don't just do bad things because they are evil or anything like that, but they're really hurt. They have trauma that they have simply not processed and gotten over. They have something they really, really care about that has, you know, messed up their moral compass a little bit. So I think there's an aspect of empathy there where the audience can see themselves in the villains and not necessarily support the villain's actions, but I think there's a level of comfort there in seeing someone do bad things that isn't 100% portrayed as an evil person.
Yeah, definitely. Do you like, which fictional character do you feel that you have a deep connection with? It doesn't have to be that maybe you see yourself in them, but maybe there's some sort of relatability. Is there a fictional character that you think you have that with?
I have to think about that one. I like, kind of like I mentioned before, I don't seek characters that are relatable, but I'm trying to think of a character that I think I would resonate with.
Yeah.
I suppose recently, I read a romance book, which I don't typically read a lot of romance, but I do like romance. It's funny because I'll like go a really long time without reading romance, and then I read it, and I'm like, oh wait, it's actually fun. I enjoy this. But it's called The Sun Is Also a Star, and the female protagonist, she is, to be fair, in the book, she's like having kind of the worst day of her life, and she is going through a lot of like really serious changes in her life. So she's not in the best mood, but her personality is she's very cynical. And she's very like logical and analytical person, almost to a fault. So she's kind of just, she's pretty cynical. She just doesn't really have much like hope in things. And I don't know, it was refreshing to see that. I kind of connected with her simply because I used to be that way. I used to be more of a cynical person. I'm not as synical anymore, although I would say I'm still kind of a sarcastic person at least. But I think I saw a good amount of my younger self in her, and that was kind of nostalgic in a way of like, oh yeah, I remember when I used to be like that. But it was also because it was refreshing to see a female protagonist be that way in a book because I think, I don't know how familiar you are with tropes in the reading community, but a lot of books nowadays, especially romances, are marketed based off of certain tropes or cliches they contain in their stories. And one very popular trope is the grumpy ex-sunshine trope, where the male protagonist is this really just grumpy guy who never smiles and is never excited about anything. And then he meets the female protagonist, who is this like sunshine, bubbly character, just always looking for adventure, always having fun. And, you know, it's kind of that opposites attract sort of thing. They get together, you know, whoop-de-doo. But in this book, it's like the opposite, where the girl is the one who's kind of grumpy, and the guy is the one who kind of, you know, gets her more excited about life and gets her to be more hopeful about things. And so it's just kind of refreshing to see that, because the trope has become really overdone to the point where it's like, it's always the girl who has to be the uplifting one. It's always the girl who has to kind of like fix this guy and make him like be happy. And I got kind of tired of that. So I think that book recently, I was like, I just really liked her character. I was just like, wow, like it is so nice to see this. Just for many different reasons.
Yeah. Do you think that like tropes or cliches within a variety of different genres, do you think that they're needed, or would you like to see more writers breaking against the mold and trying to write those characters and stories in kind of different ways within that genre? So
the thing is, I think that tropes are inevitable simply because there's only so many different kinds of stories that can be written. And there are, so there's an author I like. His name's Brandon Sanderson. He's very famous in the fantasy genre. And he has these lectures on writing, and I've listened to pretty much all of them. And in one of them, he talks about kind of a lot of new writers will focus a lot on being original. They become obsessed with this idea of being original, making sure they don't fall into doing any tropes, any sort of cliches. And he said something that just really resonated with me, and that was that it's impossible not to fall into certain tropes. Like, there are only so many stories that can be written. Most people fall into tropes, and tropes aren't inherently bad. There's a reason why they're so marketable, and that's because people know what they like. They like certain patterns in stories, whether it be for wish fulfillment or just because it's something that reflects something that has happened to them in their past, or I don't know, maybe they just like it for some reason. Pretty much every story is going to fall into certain tropes, whether you like it or not. That being said, I am a bit worried with how popular tropes have become. So I don't know if you've ever engaged with fan fiction in your life ever, but in the fan fiction community, that's kind of where tropes originated from, because a lot of fan fiction, even from like the early 2000s, when it was like just, becoming popular on the internet, would kind of, people would market their fan fictions based off of certain tropes. Like, do you like, kind of, I was mentioning like the grumpy sunshine dynamic. Oh, do you like a grumpy sunshine dynamic? Like, oh, well, like that's here. And just all these different things. And that was very popular then. But it was kind of expected for fan fiction, just because the kind of people who read fan fiction, they're usually looking for a very specific kind of story. So it makes sense for that community. But when it comes to like the publishing community, when it comes to original fiction, I am worried about how popular how popular this tendency to market books based off of tropes is. I think it becomes very reductionist for fiction, and just it also, I think it limits a lot of people. I think because if you're a reader and you only limit yourself to reading really specific kinds of books, I think you're missing out on a lot of really good stories, like stories that you might really enjoy, simply because you don't feel like branching out. I also think that it can make writing feel a bit formulaic. I'm not totally sure if I haven't done enough research to see if writers feel that there's pressure to conform to certain tropes, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are, at least in the romance genre, I would not be surprised if there were authors who felt kind of confined by tropes and felt like if they didn't have really specific tropes to market, that their books aren't going to sell. Because it is important to remember that at the end of the day, there are a lot of authors that are trying to make a living off of their writing. So I do get worried about that, because I think it'd be really sad if authors started to feel a need to change their stories in a way to fit these kind of cookie cutter molds that are being, made for like mass consumption.
Definitely. Have you ever tried your hand at writing yourself? And if so, what's like your writing process, if you have?
Yes. So I have been writing for a while. I've only recently started writing fiction. But for a long time, I really liked writing essays, like persuasive essays, just on topics that interested me. And then I would also write creative nonfiction. So if you don't know exactly what that is, there's an essayist. He's also an author, but his name's David Foster Wallace. He, to me, is like the prime example of creative nonfiction writing. He has written some really good essays on just life in general. There's one essay he wrote. It was actually a speech, but most people just read the essay, called This Is Water. And then, so I would try to mimic his style, but he definitely was the inspiration for me to try my hand at creative nonfiction. But so a lot of the fiction, or a lot of the things that I've written in the past have been nonfiction. But this past year, I actually decided that I wanted to try my hand at writing fiction. I've never really thought of myself as a very creative person in the past. I always kind of considered myself as someone who's more analytical. I like analyzing things that kind of already exist, but I never really tried my hand at creating stuff. But then I was just thinking more, and I had this idea for a story that kind of was just in my head a lot. And I was like, after a few months, I was like, maybe I should try writing this. Like, maybe I should just try my hand at it. So I've gotten pretty much a full outline of the story I want to write, and I've started writing the first few chapters. So I'm still kind of in the beginning processes, but I do have a goal. I told myself by the end of the following summer, I want to have an actual like novel written. Just a goal that I have for myself. It would be, I mean, it would be amazing if I could get it published, but I'm having a lot of fun even just right now with writing. I've sought out a good amount of resources online to help me with the process, just because writing fiction, I think, is different than writing nonfiction. So I think I needed some help with that, which is where I found the lectures by Brandon Sanderson that I mentioned previously. I think those have been really helpful. But then I'm also reading the book on writing by Stephen King, because Stephen King has written so many books. Like it's insane how many books he's written, and he's written a lot of really good books. Like maybe they're not all 5 stars, but like he's written a lot of really good books. So I'm not finished with this book that he's written about his writing process, but so far it's been really good. And I think the biggest piece of advice, and one that I'm really trying to implement, is to not rely on motivation for writing, but just really make it a habit to do it like every day. Just be disciplined. Don't rely on like wanting to write. You have to kind of like make yourself do it. So yeah.
I really appreciate that, because I'm trying to as well start to write a novel. I'm very much in the beginning phase of like doing research, drafting up characters, things like that. But as you mentioned, sometimes it can be a bit difficult to find the motivation. But I think what you said about just writing anyway, because I don't know about you, but I'm very much a perfectionist, which sometimes doesn't work in my favor. So I'd write like maybe 1,000 words and I'm like, oh no, that's terrible. And I'll like backspace all of it. But I'm trying to definitely learn to just keep what I have there. And then in the editing phase later, I can go through a lot more things. What words of advice would you give for people to kind of encourage themselves when it comes to their actual writing? Like maybe they don't think they're a good writer. What could they do to kind of get past that?
That's a hard one, because I feel like I struggle with that myself too.
Okay.
I think part of it is like, okay, the strategy that I've been taking personally is embrace the cringe. I think because like I've never written fiction before, so I try not to edit too much where I am right now, because I'm still trying to write a first draft. So I try not to spend too much time looking at stuff I've already written. But every once in a while, I'll like read a certain sentence and I'll be like, ooh, that is embarrassing. Like, that is not a good sentence. Or I don't know, like something cringe like that. But then I don't know. I think I'm learning how to embrace it as part of the process, because if you don't get the cringe out of the way first, if you don't like let yourself be kind of bad at something, then you're never gonna go far enough to be good at it. So in a way, it's like, I guess the way I think about this like novel that I'm trying to write is that I would love to finish this novel and have it be really good. But I've also kind of embraced the possibility that I might finish this novel and look back and be like, wow, like that actually wasn't that good. But even then, nonetheless, I've gotten a lot of experience. I'm sure to have learned lessons along the way that will help me should I want to write another novel in the future, which I think I do. I have another story idea that I have pretty fleshed out already, but I'm trying to save it for later because I want to focus on one thing at a time. But I think right now, what I'm trying to do to comfort myself in those moments where I'm like, oh, like this isn't good, I don't think I'm a good writer, is just embrace the cringe. Like there are going to be parts of it that are cringy. There are going to be things you say, things you write, ideas you have that you're just later like, wow, like I can't believe I thought that was a good idea at the time. But I don't know. I think it's just like, don't take yourself too seriously. Have a fun time with it. That's what I'm doing, at least.
Well, that's some really good words of advice, and I definitely will take it on board. And I think it can help someone that's listening as well. So thank you. Do you find it useful, or do you currently at the moment, do you send any of your work to like a writing buddy or anything like that at the moment?
I don't. I really want to. I reached out. I have a friend who's part of a writing group, and I reached out to them. I was like, "Hey, can I like join your writing group, please?" So I might get into that. Although, so the story that I'm writing is science fiction, and they're all like fantasy writers, which I think the genres are close enough that I could probably still like get some good advice. But that did intimidate me a little bit because I think ideally I would want to talk to someone who also at least reads a good amount of science fiction. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that has been kind of one of my priorities is I am trying to find someone to give me feedback, or I don't know, at least help me, like hold me accountable a little bit. I think having a community of writers can be very helpful for a lot of people, or at least that's what I've heard. And I believe it. So sadly, right now, no, I do not, but it is something that I am pursuing.
Okay, brilliant. If you could meet any author of your choice in person, and ask them a question, who would it be and what would you say?
That's a good question. Okay, I'm gonna assume alive. Alive, I think I would go with Brandon Sanderson because he's written a lot of books. He's very creative. Like if you've read, so he writes fantasy mostly. I think he recently started writing a science fiction series, but I have not read it yet. But he's read a lot of books, or he's written a lot of books. They're all very creative. His world building is extremely good, and for me personally, I think world building is one of the hardest things for me to do. So I think it'd be really, if I could talk to him in person and ask him questions, I would definitely ask him questions about like, how do you world build so well? Like, how do you come up with all these things and introduce them like into your stories? So yeah, I think it'd be him.
Sweet. Thank you. What's your thoughts on listening to an audiobook versus actually reading like a hard copy book?
That is also, I feel, another hot topic in the book community.
Yeah.
So I have multiple thoughts on this. So first things first, when people say the phrase, I just read this book, like whatever book it is, I just read this. Yeah. They're not referring to the physical act of reading, in the sense that they're not referring to like the act of glossing your eyes over a series of words. Like that's not what they're referring to. What they're referring to is, oh, I know this story. I'm familiar with this story. I've heard this story. That's what people are saying. So if I ask someone if they've read a book and they say yes, and then later they tell me that, oh, they listened to the audiobook, I think that still counts as reading the book, because when I think about reading a book, I'm not thinking about the act of like physically reading. I'm thinking about, oh, like, have you heard the story? That's what I'm asking them is, are you familiar with this story? And if they are, then they are. So I'm fully in support of audiobooks. I think it's a great way for people to be exposed to like wonderful stories if they have a really busy life. I'm in a phase of my life where I don't really have anyone depending on me, you know, like I don't have any children. I'm not married. I don't have any obligations towards anybody else. So I have the time to read books physically, but I'm fully aware that there are people who have much busier lives, who are on the go a lot more, who have 10 billion things to take care of, where audiobooks make it genuinely easier for them to hear the stories that they want to hear. And like, you know, have time to do it. So I think that audiobooks count as reading. I also, something that is important to consider too is there are people who are disabled, you know, if they are blind or have some sort of vision issues, who like literally cannot read books. So for them, audiobooks are kind of the only way for them to be able to hear the stories that they want to hear. So I think people need to be careful when they say that audiobooks aren't like real reading, because for some people, audiobooks are their only option. And so that can kind of get into the murky territory of ableism and that stuff.
I think you've raised some really good points, and I definitely do agree with you. I think it just depends, as you said, on like your lifestyle. Do you have the time for it, etc., etc. So definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I listen to audiobooks too. I'd say the division is probably 80% of my reading is like an actual book with paper. And then the other 20% is listening to audiobooks. But, when I'm driving, I recently did a road trip. It was like a two and a half hour drive there, 2.5 hour drive back. Like, I'm in the car for 2.5 hours. I want to do something, I'm going to put on an audiobook. So I am fully pro audiobook.
What's your thoughts on prologues and epilogues?
I think they can be nice. I think I like epilogues more than prologues, but it really depends on the kind of story that's being told. I think sometimes they can be cheesy. I think there are certain books I've read that I felt did not really need a prologue or an epilogue, but had one anyways, and it comes off as a little like pretentious in a way, just a little too try hard, of like, oh, I'm trying to make this narrative fancy, but it doesn't need to be fancy. Like, it just feels like trying to be fancy for the sake of being fancy. But I do think epilogues are really nice. And I actually have an example of a book that I wish had an epilogue. So over the summer, I read a book called The Martian by Andy Weir. It's one of my favorite books. I will definitely be rereading it. I loved it so much. It's about they made a movie out of it. Of course they did, back in 2015, but it's about a guy who gets stranded. He goes on a space mission with, like 6 other astronauts, and they go to mission to Mars, and they're supposed to just be there for a couple of weeks to, collect soil samples and just analyze the atmosphere and, do like science research for NASA. But then there's this big dust storm that hits, and, everyone have to abort the mission. So, the crew, starts running back to the spaceship so that they can just end the mission, go back to Earth. And then one of the astronauts gets lost in the dust storm. He gets hit with something, and then he passes out, and they think he's dead, and they don't have time to find him. So they go off to the spaceship, and they basically strand this guy on Mars. And the next day he wakes up, and he's like, oh my gosh, like, I'm alone on Mars. I don't have a spaceship. What am I going to do? So that's why it's called The Martian, because he spends like 2 years on Mars, trying to figure out how to survive, while, NASA is like, they find out he's alive, and then they're like scrambling to find a way to save him. But basically at the very end of the book, I don't know if this is a spoiler. I feel like it's pretty obvious that, he's going to be saved at the end of the day, but they save him. They manage to like get an expedition out to pick him up, on Mars. And it's very tense. There's stuff that goes wrong, but he does, make it on the ship. But then the story just ends. So we never find out if he even made it back to Earth safely, because there's very much still the possibility that on the way, back to Earth from Mars, that something else bad happened, and then they all died. And then we don't find out what happened to his life, which is like another thing that was interesting, because it's like this guy has this whole life that he left on Earth, and it's like we don't find out anything that happens to him. And so that was a book that I really wish had an epilogue. And when I watched the movie actually, I think the screenwriters for the movie felt the same way, because they added an epilogue scene where they showed him like 5 years later. He's living on Earth. He's safe and happy, and he's a professor at a school, and he's obviously very famous because he's the guy who survived on Mars. But I just remember watching the movie and being like, wow, like, I'm so happy they added an epilogue, because I think it can be really nice to see how characters are doing, just later on in their life, or finding out kind of what happens to just certain maybe plot points that didn't really get like tied up, at the end of the story. So I think epilogues can be really nice. I don't really have much of an opinion on prologues, but I don't know. That's what I think.
Okay, fantastic. So, like, do you think, kind of segueing on, do you think that sequels are like really important for certain stories? So I was having a conversation with someone, and they were saying that they felt as though sequels for certain novels were a bit redundant. Sometimes standalone books were a lot more poignant. What do you think?
So most of the books I read are standalones. I don't read that many series, but I do know there are a lot of series that are popular. I'm not inherently against the idea of sequels, but I do become weary of them when they are not planned in advance, in the sense that, for example, if someone publishes a standalone book that becomes very successful, just because that standalone book has the potential for a sequel doesn't mean I think the author should automatically write one, even if it's probably going to be successful. So, because I do think there's a financial aspect to it. I do think that there are authors who, they have a book that's really successful, and, they make a lot of money off of it, and they want that success again. So they write a sequel. And that's kind of what I get weary about, because, I don't know, it's hard to kind of tack on a sequel if you've written a story to be complete on its own. It's not impossible, but I do think it's harder. Now, there are a lot of authors who will write a story already with the intention of having it be a multi-book saga. They already know they want it to be a trilogy or a duology or something like that. And I think that's perfectly fine, because some stories are really long, and some stories, maybe the author wants to split up in a way that's more concrete. I think that's perfectly fine. I think it works really well for some series. I mean, I think about the Hunger Games trilogy. I think that was a really good trilogy. I think that was it was really smart how Suzanne Collins kind of set up each book. So I think sequels and series can be really great. It just depends on how the author kind of plans out the way they're going to tell the story.
Definitely. Would you rather have a book's ending spoiled for you, or would you rather never know the ending at all?
I think I'm kind of weird for this one, because I don't care that much about spoilers. There have been a few times where I've had something spoiled for me and been upset about it, but I definitely don't get as upset about it as other people do. I don't know if it's some sort of anxiety thing, but I actually kind of like sometimes knowing how a story is going to end as I'm reading it, because I think it can calm me down a bit. Just because I can know, I know this character is going to be alive by the end. I know this couple's going to get together. It's nice knowing things in advance sometimes. So I think I would rather be spoiled for a story than to never figure out what happens to them, because that would definitely be difficult. I think I would just be thinking about it for a really long time.
I have an even harder question for you. You mentioned that some of your favorite genres are between science fiction and fantasy. So would you rather only read one of those genres for the rest of your life, or read any and all genres except for those two?
Ooh. Actually, I think I would just read those two genres. I think they're so popular that I think I would have plenty of stuff to read. But it would be sad, because I really am a diverse reader. I read so many different genres. So I definitely would be still upset about it, but I think at the end of the day, I would be more upset if I couldn't read any science fiction or fantasy.
From the science fiction or fantasy books that you've read, if you could bring any of those characters into our actual world, what character would it be and why?
Oh, wow. I've never really thought of a question like this, but okay, honestly, this is just the first one that comes to mind. I think I would bring PETA from the Hunger Games, just because he is he's just such a good boy. I don't even know how to describe it, but he is just I don't know. I feel we need more. I want more people in the world like PETA. So I think I would bring PETA from the Hunger Games.
That's a cool.
I don't know if you've read the Hunger Games, but he is just he has a very strong moral compass, and it's just I really respect that. I wish we had more people like him.
Okay, that's a good answer. Have you read Dune, the book, by any chance?
I have not. I keep meaning to, but it's so long that I'm intimidated.
I was just asking because I knew that you're into that sort of genre, so I wanted to find out, did you think that the movie is better than the book, or vice versa? Because I've heard a lot of mixed opinions on it. That's why I was asking.
Yeah, no, sadly I have not. I did watch the movie, but I don't really want to speak to the movie as much either. The movie
Yeah.
was also really long, but yeah, I haven't read the books, but it is very much like a staple of the science fiction genre. Like everyone always
Yeah.
talks about Dune.
And I think the final question or final thing that I would like to ask you is if you could have maybe one of your favorite writers bring out a certain type of story, what would that story be and why that you would like to read in future that might not be out there yet already?
I mean, I honestly think it's actually kind of becoming a reality for me right now because I always really wanted Brandon Sanderson to attempt a science fiction story because pretty much everything he's written has been fantasy. But that's like
Mm-hmm.
what he's doing right now. Is he
Yeah.
recently started a science fiction series? So
Yeah.
I guess it's becoming a reality for me, even though I haven't. I like to when it comes to series, I prefer to wait until the series is complete to read them. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. For this one, I might jump on the train a little sooner than he'll finish it, just because I don't really feel like waiting super long. But yeah, I've always wanted to see him try something that was more science fictiony than fantasy, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what he's doing. So
Yeah, fantastic. I'm really looking forward to reading. I don't know if you've read any of Elizabeth Acevedo's books. She's got a new book coming out called Family Law, I think it's called. I think it's out in the US already, but it's not out in the UK yet. As soon as that comes out, I'm gonna jump on it and read it. It's got a lot of like mysticism and like magic and I don't know, like family issues and like finding yourself. And the reviews so far have been really good, so I'm looking forward to reading that. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving up your time to discuss books and writing with me on the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation and the insight that you've given to not only me but to the listeners as well. So thank you very much.
oh, thank you for having me on here. This was great, and you had really good questions. So I was very happy to discuss anything.
So I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.